Well, hello everyone. It is 2026. Happy New Year. It's been a while. I haven't been posting for a very long time. And last year, maybe earlier in the year, I forget when, but maybe out of frustration and feeling stuck, I had deleted my original channel. Whether I should have done that or not, I'm not sure, but I did, and so I re-uploaded a lot of the videos that I thought were important onto this second channel. And it is now January of 2026, and I'm making this video because I have been reading, I think, a very important book, an obscure book, but I think a very important book that touches on a lot of what I've talked about before, particularly on my previous channel. And that book, I think I've mentioned it before, but I'd like to go in a little more depth because I've been going into that book a little more depth now. And that book is Zarathustra's Sister. And that is about Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche, and his sister. And to me, I have been just absolutely blown away because it really highlights and underlines the points that I have made before about Germany and Odin and Wotan. I've talked about that before on my previous channel. I've talked about Carl Jung, I've talked about Odin, I've talked about Wotan. But now, after reading and understanding the narrative of what happened with Friedrich Nietzsche and his sister, Elizabeth, I needed to make this video. And I'll try and be direct here with the question that I think the question that I think with the help of that book, I can pose more directly here in this video. And that is the question, why was it that German Protestants, more than anyone else, were likely to support the Third Reich, to support Hitler? Why were German Protestants more likely to support Hitler than, say, German Catholics? Why were the German Protestants more likely to support him than, say, agnostics, atheists, or gypsies, or maybe they didn't have a lot of gypsies, but anyway, whatever group, and I'm sure there were a lot of groups, no doubt the German Protestants were the largest group, no doubt about that. But why was it the Protestants that supported Hitler more than anyone else? And interestingly, if you haven't heard about this already, it's worth looking up. Before the rise of Hitler, there were two different types of groups, which kind of actually prove the premise of my point, that German Protestants really wanted to support Hitler. Two different groups, let's put them side by side. One was called the German Faith Movement. The German Faith Movement, which was explicitly more about going back to the original ways of Germany, before it was Christianized. And then there was the German Christian movement, which was, about maintaining Christianity. It was about maintaining the Lutheranism, the pride in Luther and Luther's Bible, the Martin Luther who stuck it to the man, back in whatever, 1500, 60, whatever, or 6, I forget when. Anyway, that was the German Christian movement. I wanted to maintain the German Protestantism. The German Protestantism that Nietzsche criticized as a ridiculous faith. He said, is there anything more absurd than German Protestantism? Anything more lazy and lounging? And in essence, Nietzsche was saying long before the rise of Hitler. He was saying, long before that, he said, this is completely insincere, this so-called Christianity, right? And Carl Jung shared that view. He said, he appreciated the German faith movement as explicitly non-Christian because he was like, this is just really insincere, this Christianity. And so it is better, it's cleaner, it's more righteous to go back. It's not hypocritical. It's righteous to go back to, it's authentic, to go back to the original German ethos before Martin Luther. And Carl Jung, you looked at the German Christian movement, he basically said, and I'm oversimplifying, but he basically said that it was Christianity with an Odin mask. He might have actually said that explicitly, but it was Christianity with an Odin mask. And so Carl Jung saw that as the Third Reich was unfolding, as it all happened, and Nietzsche saw it before it happened. And they were both really in agreement. But of the two groups, the German faith movement, forgive me, I'm a little short of breath. The German faith movement and the German Christian movement, which one was more likely to be anti-Semitic? And I don't like the word anti-Semitic because really no one knows what a Semite is. It's kind of a dumb word. But which one was more likely to be anti-Jew? Actually, the German faith movement was much more kindly to Jews. The Odinist German faith movement was kinder to Jews, more open to Jews. And the German Christian movement was absolutely hostile to who they saw as Jews. Now, even the word Jew as well is a problem word because, as historian Tom Holland has explained, that's new within like the last 100 years or so. Didn't even exist. And it comes from the word Judea. People who are from monotheists, who are from Judea. And so within this word Jew, I think, and within this word anti-Semite, a lot of sneakery goes on, on both sides. I think people often use the phrase anti-Semite to obfuscate. And so they can lump you as an anti-Semite, a word that means everything and nothing, then they can trap you. I don't like those people. But also I don't like the anti-Jewish people who also hide in words like Jew. And they blame everything on the international Jew. Both sides are lazy with their words. And as I can see now, they feed off of each other. In a sense, they need each other. The so-called modern Jewish people, I think a lot of them, particularly the ones who run the world really, or the major institutions of the world, government or otherwise, banking, whatever, they love to use this phrase anti-Semite because it gives them power. And so they feed off of each other. These people who use the phrase anti-Semite and the actually anti-Jewish people who use the word Jew. But getting back to my original point, it was the German Christian movement who was more likely, to support Hitler. The question is why? Why was the German faith movement more likely to not support Hitler and even be open to having Jews around? Well, as I've suggested in the past, but I'm going to segue this to Nietzsche's own family, to Nietzsche's own sister, which I think helps clinch the point, seal the deal, and this video is really then a public service for the world and for history. The reason, and I don't mean to say that all so-called Jewish people were innocent of any wrongdoing. I think there were a lot of financial interests that were exploiting Germany. I am critical of the Treaty of Versailles. There was a lot of exacerbating, compounding factors like the stock market crash of 1929, etc., etc. But why were the Protestants, the German Protestants, so much more likely to support Hitler? Because subconsciously, if I can use a word from Freud, subconsciously, they didn't really want to be Christians. They actually resented their own Protestantism underneath. But it was a real pickle because their Protestantism was associated with their history and their pride of their people. In the same way that a lot of people are Catholic kind of in name only, it's kind of just an association, and they leave the reading of the Bible to the Catholics to do, the magisterium of the Catholic Church. They leave them to look at all the hard things. In the same way that the German Protestants were similar, actually. But they followed a faith in which they were supposed to read their own Bible. Technically. They were supposed to read it and think about it for themselves. But let's be honest, none of them did. Very few of them did. None of them actually had a real interest in their own Bible, in Christian history. They really just were Protestants in name only. There was a certain pride and prestige of association with Martin Luther and sticking it to the man, right? Now, and even Friedrich Nietzsche himself, when he was younger, he got caught up in that, Germania and the association of Germania with Martin Luther, because Martin Luther was the great, warrior against papal corruption, And Germans took pride in that, because they're fundamentally a warrior nation people. But at bottom, and Nietzsche would eventually come around to realize this, at bottom, Martin Luther wasn't that great. He actually wasn't that great. He and his reasons for doing what he did were actually not as noble as you would think they are. And Nietzsche would eventually see this. And then he'd be like, okay, there's something really wrong with German Christianity. Is it even authentic? Is it even real? What are we even doing here, right? But Nietzsche's sister is the archetypal example of a German refusing to think about that, refusing to think about Nietzsche's ideas. His own sister, who he loved so dearly, refused, and she loved him so dearly. Their relationship was so close, it's very odd. Some people might tend to think it's kind of incestuous. I think that's an overreach for sure. But as far as brother and sister goes, I don't think there's any brother and sister in history who have been as close as Friedrich and Elizabeth were without being incestuous. They truly loved each other. They truly had the closest brother-sister relationship. And even after Nietzsche realized that, oh my gosh, my sister and I really disagree on this, he had such a hard time letting that relationship go because it was so close. It was such a close thing, But anyway, it's kind of good in a sense that they did remain so close. And it's good that they disagreed so sharply, because not just then are Nietzsche's writings so valuable, but rather, not just are Nietzsche's writings so valuable, but his own relationship with his own sister proves his own point and proves his own very warnings. Elizabeth would eventually take charge of Nietzsche's writings, and she would eventually create a Nietzsche archive. But the whole while, from all the way from childhood to being a senior citizen to death, Elizabeth remained staunchly refusing to criticize or let go of the German Protestantism that her own brother, more effectively than anyone else, so harshly and deeply criticized. She refused to let it go. And so she is the ultimate example. And so there were books and passages of Nietzsche's that she would eventually meddle with, or try to omit things, or just to accommodate this persistent impulse to keep the Lutheran Protestantism. But as Nietzsche would imply, and as Carl Jung would eventually make explicit, this um, as much as she was willing, as much as Elizabeth was refusing to let go of the German Protestantism, I think we can say underneath it now, subconsciously, she herself was agitated by her own disposition to refuse to let go of that Protestantism. She just refused. But her subconscious wanted her to. And so, when Hitler would inevitably, eventually come along, the same Hitler who said the party stands for positive Christianity, which is basically a gutting of Christianity. It's stupid, but... And the same Hitler who was a pathetic vegetarian, the same Hitler who had pathetic sexual kinks, that same Hitler who could not, in name, he could not level with his own people how their own Christianity was actually morbidly insincere, so also Elizabeth just could not let it go. She couldn't let it go. But underneath it all, I proposed to you guys, to the viewers, that it was that insincerity and that inability, unlike Friedrich Nietzsche, who could let it go, who could recognize that it was insincere. He called it a pathetic lounging faith. He could let it go. But unlike him, most of Lutheran Germania could not. But most of Lutheran Germania subconsciously wanted to let it go. But because they couldn't, and because underneath it all they wanted to, they were agitated. And this gets to my point. The reason the Protestants supported Hitler more than any other group, percentage-wise, they were the largest percentage of Germany, likely. But percentage-wise, they were much more likely to support Hitler. But the reason they did that is because they were agitated by their own Protestantism, which they did not want underneath, and of which Nietzsche's own sister and Nietzsche's own mother were the archetypal examples. Now, there's many other things I could say, especially even about Nietzsche's father, who suffered terribly from nerves before he had his, before he perished from his horrible disease of what was called softening of the brain. I forget the actual technical word for that now. But, and it's quite ironic because Carl Jung, also, just as Nietzsche was a child of a pastor, Carl Jung, when he was young, he was critical of his own father and apparently Carl Jung was half German as well and half Swiss. But he was critical of his own father. You might maybe correct me on this, but he was critical of his own father or his own family for their insincere Christianity. So there's a lot of thematic overlap here. But getting back to my main question, forgive me, I'm trying to include multiple things here. Getting back to my main question, the reason all the German Protestants desperately wanted to scapegoat onto the Jews was because they had too much inner tension. Too much inner tension caused by a faith that they really underneath wanted to get rid of, but they didn't have the courage to do so. Thus, they were full of tension, and whenever they would see a dirty Jew, or think of Jewish financiers, they would scapegoat all their problems onto them. Now, I don't think any group of people is purely innocent. And I've become aware of, I was listening to an audiobook about the Bank of International Settlements, the BIS in Basel or whatever, and how they ultimately funded both sides of the world wars. They funded both sides. There's no one innocent in this whole thing. And nor do I consider America to be, the good guys of World War I and World War II. America was, in the same way that Nazi Germany was infected with social Darwinist eugenics. So also was America. So also was so many countries. Everyone committed atrocities. It's just a question of to what degree did people commit atrocities. And it's just that the Germans did it more wholeheartedly, the German Protestants particularly, and they did it more efficiently. Now, it's nothing particularly special though in the grand scheme, because we all know that the communists killed just as many people, in many cases way more. And they were just more messy about it and pathetic, and the Germans at least had the confidence of their convictions in the sense that they were more overt about what they planned to do. The communists always wear a smile and then stab you in the back. But in terms of why the German Protestants, again, why they overtly supported Hitler, it's because they were suffering from their own insincere faith. And thus, when the opportunity came, and especially if they could see genuine corrupt Jewish people, that would really give them confirmation that indeed all these Jews are supposedly the cause of all their problems. But Friedrich Nietzsche, was much more honest, much more authentic, much more, he was a seer. He could see into his own people's hearts. And quite paradoxically, though, his sister, who tried to butcher some of his own works, would do so. The same reason that Elizabeth would eventually support Hitler was the same reason that she would try to modify and butcher her own brother's works. Elizabeth, like many Protestant Germans, Lutheran Protestant Germans, were supportive of Richard Wagner. I'm always tempted to say Richard Wagner, but it's Richard Wagner, the great musician, the great opera house guy who created amazing works for his people. Nietzsche, for a while, when he wrote the book, The Birth of Tragedy, for a long time he fell under Wagner's spell as a great man. Now he eventually realized that was a mistake, that Wagner was, although probably better than most Germans, still not the great man he thought, still petty, still self-righteous, still just indulging in his own greatness. And it was the same reason that Nietzsche's sister butchered his own writings after he had went mad and after he had died. It was the same reason that Richard Wagner had a break with Nietzsche and didn't want to talk to him anymore. Because Nietzsche offended Wagner's Protestant sentiments. But as it was in the common German, so it was in Wagner. An insincere faith. A faith that was associated with the pride of belonging to a group. The pride of having a name for yourself. Wagner was just like anyone else who would never study the Bible on his own. And I think the Germans, they felt guilty about this underneath. And indeed, I know some Germans. I knew a German guy who was convinced that the Bible was evil and the Catholic Church was evil, even though he had never read it, In a sense, from his perspective, though, the Bible should be evil to him, in a sense. Because he probably comes from a tradition also where everyone expressed insincere faith, But why were the German Catholics less inclined to support Hitler? Because they were more overt about their values to begin with. Which is that, hey, you're not supposed to study the Bible. You're not supposed to. So there's no guilt complex about it for a German Catholic who's not reading their own Bible. Sorry. There's no guilt complex for that for a German Catholic because they're not supposed to. It's in their own Catholic constitution. You're not supposed to read your own Bible. The magisterium does that. The Protestants, though, in name, in theory, they were supposed to have interest in their own Bible. Like Martin Luther posted his how many thesis on the door of the Catholic Church pointing out to the corruption, sticking it to the man, something that the Protestants were proud of him sticking it to the man. But the average German Protestant didn't really give a fuck about the actual content of what Martin Luther was claiming. And probably most of them wouldn't have enough knowledge to be able to even unpack all the different things that Luther was complaining about. It was the fact that he stuck it to the man, There was this pride at, oh, look, a guy being tough with the corrupt, Germans love that, And I mean, good for them for liking that in general. It's good to be courageous and heroic. Stick it to the man, that's good. But Nietzsche could see what would eventually become plain to Carl Jung also, was that none of them read their Bible, none of them know anything. And underneath it all, they feel guilty about that. Because as a Protestant, you're supposed to read it. That's the whole idea of being a Protestant. You read your own damn Bible, You do your own research. You think for yourself, And even today when we say, do your own research or think for yourself, that is an afterglow of the Protestant Revolution. It's an afterglow of that. Whether you think that's good or bad, that's an afterglow of that. The Catholic Church says, no, don't think for yourself. The magisterium does theology. The magisterium does doctrine. And so if you're a German Catholic, you're not tormented enough. Because you already don't want to read your Bible. You already don't want to. And the Catholic Church gives you permission to not do that. So it's better. You have less tension inside. Well, the German Protestant is like, I'm supposed to be reading this. I don't want to. They have this constant, inner turmoil, and just this anger and this tension. You don't really want to be a Christian. You want to go back to old Germania. You want to go back to the old gods. You want to go back to Wotan. That's where your heart truly is, But you can't let go of the pride of your name, the pride of family, the pride of history, Your grandfather was a Protestant minister. Your great-grandfather was, How can you let them all down? You can't do that. You can't do that, So you're full of tension, right? And then you come along and you see a Jewish person who is, like all humans can be sometimes, genuinely corrupt. What do? All that tension inside you bursts forth and you say, it's the Jews, See, it's the Jews, they're corrupt. Maybe some of them were, maybe some of them weren't, I don't know. But Nietzsche's point is like, hey, his first surface point was, look, you guys are anti-Semitic, but you're Christians, and Christianity is Semitic. It's Jewish. What's wrong with you? If you want to be truly anti-Jewish, you'd be anti-Christ, like Nietzsche was as well. You'd be anti-Christ. That's more of an obvious surface criticism that Germans couldn't handle, Nietzsche's sister certainly, Zarathustra's sister certainly could not handle that. So on one hand, she was blown away by so much of her brother's book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. But then the second, it's 4 parts, right? She was blown away by the first part, and so much good stuff in there. And then the second part comes along, which is more, where certain sections come along that are more explicitly anti-Christian, and then she gets really uncomfortable, and she wants to edit it out or whatever, And she is just a microcosm of the grander German Protestant problem, that they don't really want that. And so what they did is they supported Hitler. And ultimately, and this is the shocking point I'm getting to, which is that although if there was no Christianity, no German Protestantism, no Lutheranism, no Luther's Bible in the consciousness of, maybe a Hitler also still would have arose. But this Hitler would have been less, and maybe even fascism would have arose. And maybe it would have been good that the German fascists took on the communists, because communism is also terrible. They'd wipe each other out, I don't know. It is terrible. But what I'm suggesting, and this is that the Holocaust would not have happened. It just wouldn't have happened. Whether the Holocaust was 2 million, 6 million, 10 or 2, it doesn't matter. Whatever the number is. And the communists have probably killed way more people than whatever the fascists have killed. They're just more messy and hide it better. their gulags and all their shit. But whatever the number of the Holocaust was, I believe it likely would not have happened if the vast majority of Germany, before the World Wars, had come to the truth moment where they, like this minority, like this one particular group in Germany called the German Faith Movement, which was trying to reconnect to Odin and abandon all Jewish religions, including Christianity. From Nietzsche's view, and from Carl Jung's view, if they had abandoned Christianity entirely, including Luther's Bible, Lutheranism, Protestantism, if they abandoned it entirely, the Holocaust would not have happened, however many died. I think at worst, the Germans would have just kicked all the Jewish people out of their country. They wouldn't have persecuted them. They wouldn't have. I suppose that is a sort of form of persecution to kick people out. But that probably would have been the worst of it. If they could have had, because then they would have kicked also the Christians out of their own country. But the pride of a name, the pride of Luther, of being associated with Luther, sticking it to the man, they just couldn't let go of. It was too associated with pride, with prestige, with the opera house, they couldn't let go of it. And so they held on, they kept that tension. Well, Nietzsche being more honest, and the German faith movement being more honest, and the Carl Jung ideas being more honest, could see the insincerity of that Christianity. If Germany had been able to adopt that, the Holocaust would not have happened. And so, when we look back in time, and we look back at the world wars, and we talk about the so-called German problem, we are being dishonest, because it is a German problem in a sense, in that this insincere Christianity is particularly unique to Germans, although insincere Christianity is everywhere. Insincere religion of everyone is a hypocrite in some way or other. But with Germany, it was particularly bad. And Germans, though, were more tormented by their insincere Christianity, I would argue, than any other race has been tormented by their own insincere faith. We all feel conflicts of interest, You want to, for instance, you've changed your mind on things. You see maybe I see the Bible differently, or I see history differently, or whatever. But let's say I grew up in a particular religious tradition, or any tradition, and I change my views. I could lose the community that I grew up in that I loved so much if I change my views. If I'm honest about that, I could lose a lot. Changing your views isn't always just a simple process. It isn't without its, tell a Muslim in a Muslim country to change his views, see what happens. Tell a fascist worshipping or a communist worshipping the North Korean leader to change their views and see what happens. It isn't always so simple. But Nietzsche, by himself, with such great courage, tried to warn everyone before the World Wars of the danger of insincere Protestantism, that it was creating a tension inside the German soul, that it would lead to disaster. And indeed it did. It led to a disaster that is still haunting the Germans to this day, still filling the Germans with guilt. So how do you fix it? How do you fix it? Well, you have to look back and consider Nietzsche's and Carl Jung's diagnosis of what happened, what that was. In a sense, you could quite ironically, you could argue that Hitler himself was kind of a bad Nazi. He was a bad fascist. Because he was kind of pathetic. He was a vegetarian. Like, what kind of wotanist, Odinist would be a vegetarian? It just kind of speaks to the confusion, And even Nietzsche's sister, her eventual husband, Bernard Forster, would eventually attempt to start a German colony abroad, but would ultimately fail at it. But he attempted, but in his new colony, he wanted to, extol the virtues of Germany and excuse me, Germany and Christianity and vegetarianism and all this. It's like, what? But these were the types that would support Hitler. And they supported Hitler because they were tormented inside. But the Germans who had the capacity to think for themselves and to recognize insincere Christianity when they saw it, those type of Germans who were exemplified or who were typified by the German faith movement, those people were more honest. They felt the need to scapegoat onto the Jews, however corrupt the Jews were, corrupt or innocent, whatever. They felt the need to scapegoat all of their own problems onto the Jews, much less so. They were much more honest. And so the way forward is to re-understand the world wars as fundamentally a religious crisis being pushed to the head, as Nietzsche predicted. And then the way then I think the honest path for the Germans forward from now is to reflect on the German faith movement. And for modern Germans, do they have the courage to question the most basic of things, their precious Protestantism, their precious insincere Protestantism? And can there be an honest evaluation of history and to rethink Odin and Wotan? Do Protestant Germans have the ability to reconsider Odin? Do they have the ability? Well, if they have, whether they do or whether they not, that I think would be the only way forward in this regard. Anyway, this video has been a public service. I hope it can have a part in helping people to reconsider the dogma of how we see the world wars. To think about it through the lens of Nietzsche and to think about it through the lens of people like Carl Jung, who said, by the way, a German Christian, and I quote, "A German Christian is a contradiction in terms. The God of the Germans is Wotan, not the Christian God." Thanks for listening.